next step in our agenda. We have a terrific panel discussion, and staying in the spirit of talking about AI and actually really linking well, actually, I think, with Brian's talk, we're going to talk about the business case for AI and how we optimize and operationalize intelligent automation to drive value and meet the growing demands of our organizations. And so we'll be inviting Tom Wild, the CEO of Indico, back from yesterday, and also inviting Ken Mertzel of Automation Anywhere. And I'll let each of these gentlemen introduce themselves before we get started. Tom, do you want to go first?
Great. Yeah, thanks. Great to be here. So Tom Wild, CEO of Indico. We are a Boston-based intelligent process automation solution focusing on unstructured content use cases primarily. So those are things like email and document intake and understanding, image and video intake and understanding, basically trying to solve this huge river of stuff that flows through most major enterprises, and to date has been a very difficult problem area to solve.
Sure.
I'll go next.
Ken.
Yeah, I'm Ken Mertzel. I'm the global industry leader for financial services at Automation Anywhere. For those of you not familiar with us, we're one of the leading players in the RPA space. And I think today's conference is interesting because our platform, and as we'll talk about others, we're increasingly seeing the way it's going in terms of integrated platforms. We have a lot of integrated capabilities beyond just RPA. And so my role is to help drive use cases, particularly in the financial services industry and also in the finance function.
Terrific, Ken. Thank you. And so for our audience, again, this is an opportunity for you guys to get involved in the conversation. We'll direct a little bit of discussion here on stage and take this conversation down the path that we think is interesting. But as you have questions and you want us to be directed somewhere else, please do join in by clicking that Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. And we'll get your questions involved in the discussion. So I thought we might start actually sort of launching off from where Brian left off. Brian's shared with us what the U.S. government and the military, and in particular the intelligence agency, is doing with AI. But maybe we could start with what is business pragmatically today doing with AI? What are the useful applications we can expect in the near term? What should we be working on now? And Tom, why don't we go ahead and start with you on that?
Yeah, and just kind of really picking up right where you just left off. I think this notion of automation is maybe a little bit problematic as we move into AI focused use cases. I think it's sort of a convenient description, but we have to unpack it a little bit. So when you talk about AI, AI is mostly a probabilistic technology, right? And when you think about things like RPA or BPM, they're very deterministic. They're sort of a right or wrong answer. What that means is when we think about using AI, we have to think about it in terms of augmentation. So the analogy I always like to use, and you may have heard me yesterday use the same analogy, is that rather than think about AI as a series of robots that will come in and sit down and do work, we have to think about it much more like a bionic arm, right? That we're gonna affix a bionic arm to our knowledge workers, and instead of being able to lift 100 pounds, now they can lift 10,000 pounds. But they are still the ones operating this bionic arm. So it's kind of a general framing of the opportunity. I think that's a very important one to have when you step into using AI in the enterprise.
No, that's a great analogy. I mean, I think it really extends the conversation about augmented people, and also I think the commentary about human in the loop versus human on the loop, which I think is a great distinction that Brian introduced in the conversation. Ken, do you want to talk about specific places that you see AI being used, maybe in the finance function or in the finance industry, where maybe that bionic arm is actually already augmenting our workers today?
Yeah, and I think there really has been a migration from pure RPA to, in the future, sort of the integration of RPA with other AI-like technologies. And while some of the AI technologies aren't as mature, there are a lot that are being utilized today. So I can give you 3 examples. One of them is, in fact, Brian talks a little bit about intelligent data extraction. So historically, everyone's used to the old OCR technology, but increasingly you're seeing a lot more usage of machine learning, computer vision, natural language processing integrated into that capability. So much higher throughput rates you're seeing, and therefore you can do much more with the information. A second example would be whereas, historically people would do RPA and then kind of stop and have humans involved in doing exception processing. You're seeing machine learning models be applied so that you can look at the various patterns of when different exceptions are handled in different ways, and therefore be able to automate a good percentage of those. And then I think the third area where we've seen a lot of focus in financial services, insurance, and many other industries is around fraud detection. So historically, in the early days, it was much more rules-based. Nowadays, again, you're looking at patterns of data to identify potential alerts and potential risk for fraud. So those are just 3 examples of what's being done today. But again, there are going to be many more applications going forward.
No, that's terrific. And I think those applications are actually really relevant to most businesses. We all have some flavor of those things going on, regardless of what kind of company we're running. All right, now to put you on the spot, Ken. That's great about what we're doing today, but give us a sense of the pace of change in this field. Where will we be? You pick 3 years, 5 years. What should we be anticipating the capabilities having developed into in that time frame?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I don't have the crystal ball, so I can't give you an exact time frame, but you just look at the rate of change that's occurred over the past few years. I mean, RPA, which isn't even AI, right, has been doubling every single year, and the AI technology, absolutely the same. So again, I think going forward, we're absolutely going to see it in, AI being used pretty commonly and integrated with other technologies. On top of that, I think one of the things that's accelerating is that a lot of the technologies, whether it's RPA, intelligent data extraction, et cetera, they're driving it such that you don't have to be a data scientist to use it. So the point is that it's very user-friendly, low-code type technology, drag and drop. So I think that's another thing that's accelerating it. So behind the scenes, there's very sophisticated technology, but the fact that there's very simple UIs up front, so it's less of a black box technology, which is important for users, but frankly also for auditors and for regulators, is something that's also going to accelerate the technology going forward.
That makes perfect sense. So Tom, as we accelerate, as businesses need to embrace this technology, what are some of the things that we need to do to achieve scale? What are the things we need to be taking into consideration as businesses?
Yeah, I think Ken touched on a couple of them. I think that the citizen data scientist is a huge trend, at least from a demand side, that customers are looking for. It's driven by the reality that there just aren't enough data scientists in the world to build all the use cases that customers have, and there needs to be sort of force multipliers delivered to both data science and line of business to get after these opportunities much faster, and sort of stop having to reinvent the wheel every time on a lot of the sort of lower level stuff that is becoming more more solved, more commoditized. I do think that AI governance is a big wave that's going to break over industry, in 2021. That the governance and compliance folks are going to assert themselves more strongly and say, hey, you can't deploy this unless you can explain it, unless there's an audit trail, unless we know how to remediate it. And that deals with issues of things like bias. And I know that bias in the press is often talked about in terms of social terms, but the sort of more scientific definition is just you've influenced a model to tip in one direction rather than the other, because you either deliberately or inadvertently trained it with an incorrect cross section of your data. So I think those issues, both how did the model get built and how is it performing and how do I remediate it when I need to, are going to be vital to establish upfront if you're going to scale AI into the enterprise.
So I think these questions of governance and explainability are potentially barriers to adoption. Is there a good way for business people to be able to say, hey, here's a class of problems where I need to apply sort of more rigor, more auditability, and taking a thread again from the conversation with Brian, more ethical approach, versus areas or domains where I can apply more versus less, right? Is there a distinguishing factor? I think Brian's example was, hey, if I'm just processing invoices, do I really have an ethical problem versus do I need to, make sure that I'm correctly identifying a hospital as a civilian infrastructure that should not be bombed, right? There's a clear line of ethics there, right? But do you see that in business? Is there a dividing line?
I mean, in some cases, right? If you're talking about making decisions on who to extend a loan to, those clearly have social implications, right? And need to be accounted for. But I think just generally speaking, bias is an important topic in terms of how will you teach the model. I think the thing to understand about AI is AI is still very much an intelligent parrot, right? It's not magic. It's an intelligent parrot. It learns whatever we teach it. It can make some conclusions on its own, but they're limited, to what it's been taught, what it's seen prior. So that becomes very, very important to think about when deciding to apply AI to a problem, which is, do I have a high quality representative set of training data that I can use to do this? Who is making that judgment? Who is providing the labels for that data that I want to inform the AI to understand? And we find that a lot of times in starting a project, you often find that the team around the table, the customer, will all say, yes, we have a very well-defined, approach to this process that we use today, and we just want to sort of infuse that into an artificial intelligence approach. But when you start to look at their training data, you realize that they're all labeling the data differently, and it causes this moment where they all kind of get around the table virtually and say, okay, shoot, I guess we don't have a reified process here. We got to kind of get on the same page before we can teach the model, because otherwise the model will say, hey, I don't know what to do with this. You guys all have a different opinion about what success looks like here.
No, that makes sense. I think certainly one of the challenges of being able to start using AI pragmatically in industry is the ability for us to have clean, well-labeled data. And I'm struck, and Ken, maybe I'll jump back to you. I'm often struck in working with clients in my role at Bain that cleanliness of data can become a reason not to do anything. In contrast, in my view, actually automation and products like yours can actually give companies an on-ramp to being able to start to sort out those data problems. And maybe you can reflect a little bit on what you see as the connection between the historical definition of automation and this new definition of intelligent automation that includes AI, and how the two link together.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things on that point. I mean, one, absolutely data is critical, but no matter what technologies we have, there's never going to be perfect data, right? And so usually the challenges that most businesses have is too much data, and it's trying to figure out how to leverage all that information in the appropriate manner and identify sort of the single source of the truth. But in terms of, RPA and AI, I mean, again, I think probably the term AI is overused, and it's probably, I view it kind of as a spectrum of technologies. And so over time, I view it as really, a lot of companies are kind of starting out with RPA. Again, it's high transparency. You know exactly what you're going to get. It's rules-based. And then over time, companies are adding more and more, AI type capabilities, machine learning, AI, et cetera. And again, often being built into the platform. So I see it as more of a progression, but I do think, to Tom's point earlier, I do think transparency, whether it's RPA or AI, is absolutely critical. And it's critical because you as an operational manager need to understand exactly what the technology is doing. You still have responsibility for it, and as I mentioned before, in addition, your auditors or regulators are going to have that expectation as well.
Yep, no, that's terrific, Ken. I want to remind the audience to use the Q&A function, and we'll start getting your questions into the conversation flow as well. I wanted to switch gears a little bit and be a little bit more forward-looking. Not that talking about AI isn't in itself forward-looking already, but I do think that we can spend a lot of time talking about the technology, as we've done sort of in the first half of this conversation. But actually, the human factors, as we've started to transition to in this part of the conversation, end up being maybe the bigger barriers to success, adoption to success. And I think one of the major questions here is about really the broad-based transformation of the workforce, and what are the kinds of trends that we see. And just to throw out a little bit of thought-provoking sort of picture that I shared with both of you yesterday when we were preparing for this talk. So if you think about a contact center, and I think most of the businesses on the line today have some sort of contact center in their business, whether maybe it's just to support employees, maybe it's to support external vendors or suppliers, or maybe it's directly to support your customers. But typically the model for a contact center has been, I have a large number of low cost, low trained, lowly empowered individuals who are following rules about resolving problems that they're getting on the phone. Well, now if I fast forward, if I think about the next decade of transformation and what these technologies will be able to provide me with in terms of both textual language understanding, voice language understanding, the ability to follow those rules and take the action that a human would have taken, I think we can anticipate that the vast majority of the contacts that those individuals are receiving today are actually going to be handled either through self-service or through some sort of automation and AI combination. And so we can look forward to a point, and I'll just draw the line 10 years from now, where in 10 years, we're going to have a very different kind of contact center. We'll probably still have people, because there will still be some exceptions where there's some complexity outside the range of the rules-based and AI-based understanding to process. But what it means is I'll have a very small number of people who have a different skill set. They'll be highly trained, highly paid, and highly empowered, because they'll be making decisions outside of the domain of the rules. And so I need, as an organization, to go through this transformation where I've got that set of augmented, highly paid workers in the future from the state that I've got today. And I think this presents a big organizational transformation problem that all of us need to actually get started on today. But let me get Ken, first your reaction to that, and then Tom, I know you have an interesting contrary view too.
Yeah, I think there are definitely major implications for the workforce. But one thing I'd remind you is when people think about, well, AI, RPA, et cetera, will eliminate all the workers. Think about back when the laptops came out, right? And people just assumed, oh, well, now that laptops exist, all that work will be gone. So I think just the nature of work, as you mentioned, is going to change. So, and I view it much less as a replacement for people, but more of an enabler, like you talked earlier about the augmented workforce. So, what I see down the road is so everyone, no matter what type of role you're in, will have a bot, if you will. So just as today everyone uses Excel or Excel macros, I could see down the road everyone has that bot that'll be enabled by machine learning, artificial intelligence. And I think part of the ability of the technology will be able to take those people who maybe were considered less skilled or less knowledgeable in a certain area, and bring them up to the level of an individual like your most experienced underwriter, your most experienced claims adjuster. So I see a lot of enablement there, and certainly the focus is more going to be today where maybe there are a lot of routine exceptions where where employees are handling those. You're going to focus on that maybe 10% where it really does require human judgment and experience to address. So I don't think it'll necessarily completely replace people, but absolutely the type of work will change over time.
Yeah, I think that maybe setting the call center aside for a second, because I think it's a bit of a unique animal, and I agree with you, Ted, in what you say in the call center. Let me use a different use case maybe to illustrate the point. Let's use like claims analysts at an insurance company, or people performing the regulatory compliance function at insurance companies. There, you have to kind of hire someone who has a fairly strong median skill level, right, in terms of tenure and education and experience. And that's because they have to be able to handle a wide range from the mundane to the sophisticated in order to keep the process rolling. I think AI sort of creates this barbell where that sort of hiring to the median goes away, and you're able to hire a much less tenured person and they become proficient much faster because they're sort of AI enabled day one. And then you have very senior people who become the ones who are constantly looking at the overall process, and they're the ones who are informing the artificial intelligence in what to learn, right? So they're defining what a successful process looks like. Again, something that a sort of medium skilled person you can't have them do that either, because they don't have enough skill to do that. They have too much skill in some ways to do the mundane. So I almost see that it sort of pushes the middle out to the two edges, as almost like a barbell in terms of skill.
No, it's an interesting observation. I think maybe the takeaway for the audience is we actually have some work to do to look at each of the activities or each of the categories of work that we do as enterprises and understand how differently AI will be applied and how it will transform that, that particular discipline. So in some cases, as you point out in claims processing, I get the barbell effect. And in some cases, like contact center, I get the steepening of experience effect. Maybe there are a couple of archetypes that, as an output of this discussion, we can work on and give back to the community and say, okay, here, look at these archetypes and say, which of these fits that particular kind of work in your business?
Yeah, great.
So let me actually try to get some practical advice now for the audience. I think, amongst the companies here, some have gotten started on their journey and have done some initial steps. Probably not very many have gone a long way toward applying AI, and some haven't started at all. So maybe we can start with some practical advice on how should companies get started? What should they do to start this journey? Because I think I can probably count on both of you saying this is a journey that we should all be on. So Tom, since we ended with you last, you want to start, and then Ken, you can follow up with some practical advice.
Yeah, I think what's so critical is, this is true of any automation project. Ask yourself, why do you think you can automate this, right? But before you do anything, like, should we automate this? Is there enough volume? Are there enough dollars in this process today that we think we can take out to make this worthwhile? Because a surprising amount of time, that basic question hasn't really been scratched at the start. And we'll get projects and I'll look at it and say, wait a minute, the cost to automate this is going to exceed what you'll ever save. So this is a bad candidate. So I think that's a critical first step. That seems kind of obvious. The second one is define success and work backwards. So what is the definition of success here? What is the data you're trying to generate? What is the savings you're trying to capture? And work backwards until you get to the point that you've been able to identify whether it's vendor platforms you're going to use, upskilling of people you need, training data you need. Just keep working backwards until you've got it laid out. Then you're kind of ready you have a straw man that you can start to work against. So I think that's a really critical point to think about at the outset.
That's a great point. So Ken, I'm going to extend the question a little bit further and say, so you're getting started, you're doing things that Tom just talked about, and now you want to actually get a vendor involved. What advice can you give about how to vet the vendor that you might be using? What questions should I be asking my technology vendors as they help me get started on this journey?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple different things. I mean, certainly you want to look for, ideally you don't want to have 100 different vendors and to do all the different things you need to do. So I think just understanding the full suite of capabilities that they offer in their tool, as well as the enterprise nature of that, so that again, to the extent you start scaling, you'll be able to leverage that tool as you get larger and larger. You certainly want to look at the level of support you're getting. In other words, are you going to buy a tool and then the vendor's gone? So particularly in the early days, it's really critical to get support not only from the vendor, but many instances bring in a third-party firm just to get you off and running. I think is absolutely critical. And then again, I think you just want to make sure that you have an enterprise-grade platform, because particularly we've all talked about the fact that this is very much a data-based exercise. You want to make sure that you have the appropriate levels of security, audit trails, transparency, etc. I think just adding on to Tom's points as well. I agree with what he said. I think part of the challenge people have is they get excited about a technology and they start thinking about how do I apply that technology, as opposed to starting back from what are my biggest business challenges, right? What are the biggest problems I need to solve? And then from there, what are the technologies that will help me apply there, I think is a different way to orient it. And then, lastly, I think where companies get stalled is Initially, again, one group might get excited about a technology or what have you, and so they do their own thing. But over time, to the extent you want to scale, you really do want to set up a centralized organization that works in conjunction with the business units, who provides, again, that level of governance and control, the QA, sharing best practices, and then work that in sort of a federated model where you have point people within each of the businesses that can clearly better understand their own operations, prioritize opportunities, help with the initial design. So over time, it becomes more and more important, especially as you want to scale, to have that, not a massive team, but a centralized group so you can, coordinate that program and have the appropriate change management, et cetera.
No, that makes great sense. Although hiring those people is quite expensive, I heard a story recently of a PhD graduate in AI who had, presumably written some really outstanding research papers, but being fought over by industry and ultimately being hired by one of the tech companies for a 7-figure salary. So right out of a PhD program. So this can be a very expensive thing to go and put that team in place. And I think, maybe there's 2 questions, Tom, coming back to you, from the audience about how you get this started. Certainly aligning with what the business value is critical, but there is a big investment, even if you're not hiring that 7-figure PhD. There's a big investment to be made in talent to be able to create this capability, and it's going to require senior leadership endorsement. So how can you get buy-in from leadership for this kind of investment?
Yeah, this is a great area of discussion that I see also a big issue looming in 2021. I think that enterprise got very excited about building up competitive advantage through data, right? Which is a good instinct. It turns out that every company on the planet is a data company at the end of the day. You can capture advantage through your data. I think what I see, though, is the mistake when we're talking to customers sometimes is there's a natural sort of build versus buy question which should be asked, right? But I think it's always asked not quite in the right manner. So they'll turn to the data science team and they'll say, can you solve this? Can you build this? And that's not quite the right question. The question is, should you solve it? Should you build it? Because my experience with data science teams, especially within BFSI, they're super skilled, right? The teams are really impressive. And the answer is yes, they can build almost any of these individual, challenges or use cases. But there hasn't been a lot of discussion as to when should we build? When do we need to own, the particular algorithmic and application stack, versus when is it better to have a vendor come in and help the data science team, use that as a force multiplier. So that sort of vetting and that heuristic hasn't really been well laid out yet in my experience in the enterprise. Is can you build it versus should you build it? And I think that's a big one, because you can't scale your data science team to 200, 300, 400 people. You can't compete with Google and Facebook for that kind of talent. You need to think your data science team much more as sort of the center of excellence, the best practice, but not necessarily the folks who are always putting hands on keyboard.
Yeah, terrific practical advice, and but I do want to make sure that we answer the question that was asked from the audience, which was, now, how do I convince senior leadership? Because and I'll just anecdotally say, I have had the unfortunate experience more than once of sitting with a senior leader who says to me about some digital transformation initiative, hey, you know what? I'm going to retire in the next 5 years. Can you just make this wait until after I'm gone? Yeah. So how do we get these folks on board and recognize there's an investment that needs to be made now so that we're prepared for the future?
Well, I think there are a couple things to that. So one is certainly, just like you do with any project, having a business case around it. Again, that's the point of, like, you've identified this particular business challenge and what's the value you're going to get out of it. There's a lot of temptation to sort of experiment with these different technologies, which is fine. But if you want initial, support from executive leadership, A, you better have a business case, and B, don't pick the absolutely most complex process in the entire company on day one. So pick something where you can get some quick wins and demonstrate the return on investment you get there before you move on into some of those other projects. I think the other way to be successful too is to demonstrate, particularly in financial services, where frankly it's one of the industries furthest along in terms of leveraging technology, to also show a lot use case examples where it's been applied frankly, with your competitors or in the industry successfully, right? So whether that's in loan origination, customer service, there's a whole, in compliance, there's a whole variety of examples. And I think knowing that you're not, going to be the first one. I mean, companies want to leverage the technology, but not necessarily be the first mover. And so I think showing that, look, frankly, if you don't take some of these actions now, you're actually, not only not in the lead, but you're actually behind. But then backing that up with, solid business cases and then proven results is key.
And I think on the business case side, I think senior management has become jaded in the pitch of we're going to reduce cost this way. I think what I've seen be more successful is here's how we're going to make our existing team more efficient and therefore cost avoidance in the future. So a big project we just worked on with a Fortune 100 customer in a large division, that's what they took to senior leadership is, look, we think our workload is going to grow by 30% next year. We think we can do it with the same amount of people by leveraging automation. And that really landed with leadership, as opposed to, trust us, our costs are going to go down by 20% next year. Leadership just doesn't buy it because you just don't see that actually come to fruition generally.
Yeah, I agree. Really, the message around empowering people, and look, we'll free up capacity, and so you don't have to hire as many people to get just as much work done, is absolutely resonating, I think, with executives.
Well, let me ask you on that thread to be as specific as possible. Give the audience one concrete, and be as specific as you can. Even what's the company, what's the results, if you can mention it. But certainly be as specific as possible at what the sort of mature use case is for AI ML in a particular business industry function that our audience could say, okay, great, that's a launching off point for me. I can go and grab that and think about how that applies in my company.
I mean, I can give you one example. Chatham Financial, who's a great customer of ours and has really embraced this approach. The way they thought about it is they had a 6-month backlog of trade confirmations that they were trying to clear, and they've been, up until now doing it completely manually. So, customer satisfaction was impacted by the slow turnaround of these trade confirmations. By using automation, they were able to clear that 6-month backlog once they had deployed the workflow in 4 days, something like that. So that actually had a very significant positive impact on customer satisfaction, rather than, and of course it was less expensive per task, but that really wasn't what was driving it. They really wanted to drive CSAT, by reducing the turnaround time on these things. So that's an example.
And Tom, in that particular example, what was the use of machine learning?
So this was using Indico's transfer learning approach to build a custom machine learning model to ingest these trade confirmation documents from hundreds of third parties, turn them into a very specific data payload, and inject that into the trade order management system.
So if I parse that, I think what you're saying is you had documents that came in lots of different formats, and so you needed to extract the information in a structured, consistent way to be able to put it into the system of record. So if I generalize it for the audience, like, okay, well, here's a great example. I've got documents in lots of different formats, and I've got to restructure the data. Well, a machine can actually be trained to do that restructuring so that I have a consistent data set. Yeah?
Exactly. How do you turn documents into data? Then they become actionable, right?
Yeah, perfect. Ken, do you want to offer a specific example?
Yeah, I mean, and we see lots of examples like that across all industries. I'll just give some from the industry I come from financial services. I think too, certainly we're seeing in the mortgage industry, just given the tremendous volumes that are now coming through, particularly in refis, given the low rates. And so they're hit with exactly the issue we were, Tom and I were talking about earlier, right? Which is how can I possibly process all that volume with my existing capacity, because there's no time to hire up. And so we're seeing the utilization of, a combination of RPA and machine learning to handle that volume. And that's both in terms of the ingestion of applications, the ability to, fulfill and actually order appraisals. And then also, as Tom was talking about earlier, in terms of particularly the ingestion of documents that are through that process, so that again, the processors are spending less time reading through the documents, parsing out the data, validating they have all the information they need. That basically the ML technology is doing that for them. The other real brief example I'll mention is, nowadays, given all the forbearance programs that banks are having to run, and basically either proactively or reactively reschedule all the loans for customers, we're seeing banks now that predicted they would have had taken 1 to 2 years to process all and reschedule all those loans, to be able to do it now in a matter of weeks by leveraging these technologies, which has not only a big impact from an operational cost standpoint, but more importantly in terms of the impact on their business and individual customers, not putting them in delinquency status in the current environment.
Terrific. Those are great pragmatic examples, and hopefully our audience is ready to rush right out and start to implement these things. We'll just do a quick rapid fire closing. Any last advice, Tom, we'll start with you, to the audience about getting started?
I think getting started, there's a lot here that you have to think about going forward. So it's not just about an algorithm or a model. It's sort of a one-time proof point. You have to think about this thing becomes a living thing that has to be maintained into the future. So it's also planning for the long-term maintenance and care and feeding of the artificial intelligence you put into place. So I think that's an important consideration.
I like that image of, I've got this new being that I have to feed in my room.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Ken, last word. What
yeah, I think, similar to what we discussed before, I think, again, start small, focus on what the business challenges are that you need to address. Leverage maybe less sexy technologies initially, like, we see a lot of customers using RPA initially and then adding on and embellishing with more of those machine learning AI capabilities over time, so that, you're addressing the right things and getting it done with, mature technologies while continuing to innovate as well.
Terrific. Very, very good pragmatic advice. So hopefully we're all ready to go out and Monday morning start our programs. Thank you so much to Tom and Ken for joining us for this morning session. Unfortunately, we're out of time and we're going to need to move on to the next step in our agenda. But, I definitely encourage folks to follow up with Ken and Tom with additional questions that you have. It looks like you guys could both be great resources to all of us as we're on our journey here. Thank you.
Good talking to you.
Thanks, Ted.
Great.